welcome back. I hope you've been enjoying the story so far. I've got a lot more to go, and eventually I would like to get into my novels and reading them piece by piece, not the 200 to 300 or more pages that I've got to go at or stretch, because that would be boring and would probably rob me of my voice for a few days. But the story I've got coming up, End of the Road, is a part of my main series titled Of Light and Shadows, which has run for several books and a couple trilogies. But it's just a small slice of what can be expected in the story, and look into one of my main characters and how they interact with the people around them and the world as it's become in the future. So, here's End of the Road. Hope you enjoy. And now, End of the Road from my anthology, The Beachcomber's Delight. End of the Road, Neutral Zone, Oregon. They'd wandered into the wrong territory. That was it. They had gone searching for something in the jungle and had run afoul of one of the many gangs that called the city home. And that was it. But instead of chasing them out of their territory and leaving it at that, several of the gang members, more than enough to threaten their small group, had continued after them, howling for their blood and seeking to punish them for their mild transgression. It was known by every person that lived within a 50-mile radius, and in some cases further, that the jungle was off limits unless one was invited. The gangs that dominated the city rarely ever wanted anything other than trouble, but they knew better than to try and cross the river to Riverside, as there were plenty of measures that had been taken to protect the other side on the northern bank. Plus, trying to cross the mile-wide river would be suicide thanks to the presence of the Durges, the meters-long homicidal guardians that lived beneath the water's surface, and who were always willing to defend their territory. The Neutral Zone, known in legends as Hayden Island or Jansen Beach, was a place where anyone could wander, but where it existed outside the territories would have no support and no limits upon what could happen to them and what they could do. That's all it says. In other words, it was a danger zone in which anything could happen, and most denizens of the surrounding areas knew this. Did we lose them? Her voice sounded just as scared as she felt, and as she looked around the room, they found themselves in. The other three people she was with remained silent. They had found this place out of necessity, but it wasn't bound to be a refuge for much longer. The tracking skills of those that were on their trail were simply too great. "What's that sound?" asked one of the other women in the group. The others looked around, no doubt seeking anything that might be making too much noise, their eyes wide as they tried to seek out anything at all that might give them away. It was just then that she heard it finally, though she couldn't understand what it might mean. It sounded like ticking. Monotonous, constant ticking. "What is that?" The others didn't reply, but as they stayed still, the ticking stopped for just a moment, allowing their breathing to become the loudest noise in the structure. Around them, the winds coming in off the nearby river that separated one state from another rattled branches and ancient windows in their rotting casings, bringing to mind the image of a million hands trying to shake the place apart, piece by piece. The ticking came again, more rapid this time as she felt her nerves tighten and her heartbeat quicken. Her blade, strapped to her waist, felt unbearably heavy where it rested as she tried to slow her heartbeat in that moment. "It sounds like it's coming from the next room," one of the two women whispered, nodding in the direction they'd come from to reach this back area. The home they'd managed to hide in was bigger than many of the structures in this compound, and unlike many of them, it was still intact, despite the passage of so much time. Thankfully, the lock still worked, and the doors were still closed, but they all knew just how fragile these safety measures could be against the creatures who were hunting them. She knew it was foolish, that she was taking her life and those were people into her hands, but as she rose from where she sat, drawing her blade, she found herself moving forward and then rounding the corner into the long hallway they'd come through. Turning right immediately, she entered one of the two rooms that they noticed on the north side of the home. What she saw not only confused her, but was nearly the end of them all. The room was strangely devoid of any sense of decay. In fact, it looked like something out of the old movies that they occasionally got to watch back across the river on special days. There was a computer, an actual working computer, in the left corner of the room. The control tower resting beneath the desktop and the screen resting atop the middle tier of the desk just above the main desktop. Sitting at the desk, comfortably ensconced in a dark, plush chair, was a man that appeared to be in his 30s or 20s, or just couldn't decide. "Who are you?" she asked, the blade trembling in her fingers as she gulped loudly. "Look at the screen and you might find out." She nearly jumped out of her skin as she noticed the speaker sitting just in front of her, wondering how she'd missed him since he was big enough to have caught her eye the moment she turned the corner. While she couldn't determine the age of the man at the computer, the person in the plush seat right in front of her looked no older than his mid-20s at best, though he looked undeniably dangerous, despite the fact that he wasn't armed. "Oh, come on, man," he said to the male at the computer. "I don't look that dangerous." She frowned, but then looked at the screen and couldn't help but gasp again as she saw the man's fingers fly across the keyboard in front of him, his eyes never leaving the screen as the words continued to flow across it. Her blood ran cold as she saw what was appearing on the screen, her eyes widening as she looked at the other man, who merely grinned at her in a rueful sort of way. "Trust me," he said, it gets to be more annoying than anything after a while." The words she was speaking, that the stranger was speaking, that she was thinking, were being shown on the screen. How could that have been, though? "How?" she asked in a breathless voice, watching as her question appeared on the screen. "It's a long explanation," the man in the chair said, "but I bet that you don't have time to hear it. You're running from the thorns that are currently on the island. Yeah?" She frowned as her gaze shifted to him. "How did you know?" He shrugged. "That's my thing. I come and go, and I know things. If you want to make it to the bridge, I'd suggest you get moving. They're going to start beating down doors eventually." "Who are you?" The man looked at her, his eyes coming fully visible as she recoiled from the dark, inky black orbs that now stared in her direction. "This is what you want to talk about right now? You have 3 others and yourself to keep alive. You want to know who I am?" Looking between the man and the screen, she couldn't seem to form an answer in that moment, but as she tried to work her jaw around the words, a sound in the distance could be heard, and her blood turned to ice in that instant. The guttural, barking language that was part English, part something else, came from out to the left, far too close for her liking as she stood, frozen, her blade still dangling in her nervous fingers. "I'd step to the left," the man said calmly, as though he'd just been stating that the day was slightly overcast. She didn't ignore him, though, as she stepped to the side, peering around the jam of the door as the clicking continued. Was the strange writer taking down everything that was happening? Despite all evidence to the contrary, yes, the man said. Human eyes just aren't able to see the story in its entirety. Be glad of that. Even as she continued to peer around the jam, she saw as a single figure came bounding into view, snuffling as a spike-covered body twisted this way and that. Or it could have been a her. It was hard to tell with thorns. Their entire bodies were covered in curved spikes that were at least 3 inches long, if not longer. They were usually unkempt and hard to determine when it came to gender. All that was definitively known about them was that they were deadly and extremely ill-tempered, and they didn't give up easily. "Woof," the man said as he looked out through the sliding glass door at a perfect view of the street. A wide wooden deck separated them from the main path as well, connected to the home as it ran to the left and right, but it didn't feel like nearly enough of a barrier to her. I forgot how ugly those damn things are. Right then, she didn't know whether to laugh or pee herself, but thankfully she didn't perform the latter involuntarily. The idea that this could be worse than death almost made her laugh. The creature was joined by several others, more than she could remember having seen chasing them. She ducked out of sight. As she tried to still her breathing, she heard the man sigh as he stood to his feet, straightening his clothing, which she now noticed was a little more in a rumpled sweatshirt, a pair of blue jeans, and a pair of scuffed sneakers. All items of the old world as she learned it, making her suddenly think that he was someone that might have been older or far removed from the world she knew about. "Stay here," he said calmly. "I'll see if I can persuade them to move on." "What?" she muttered. He moved past her down the hall, not looking back. Instead, he paused for a moment, still not looking around as he said, "Just in case, though, take this door to the left and be ready to run." She was going to ask what he meant, but as she looked back to the room where her people still huddled in fear, her mind was whirling with the possibility of escape. When she looked back to the stranger, he was gone. She felt the hesitancy that threatened to keep her where she was at that moment, but instead, she remembered who she was and peered into the room where her people still were. "You ready to go?" When the moment came, they ran. They hit the door the stranger had indicated in the small room off to the left of the hallway, and they ran. She felt certain that the thorns had torn the stranger apart, that he'd somehow, for some reason, sacrificed himself for them. In fact, she felt horrible for leaving him without even coming to his aid. But she had her own people to worry about, and her fear for their safety was keeping her going as they ran for all they were worth, making their way quickly out of the compound and out to the long, winding road that they knew would lead them to the old bridge that had been converted into a mechanized barrier for their enemies. They were only a few hundred yards from the bridge now. They could see it in the distance, and yet she could feel her energy flagging. The armor she wore, patchwork though it was, still added a good deal of weight to her form, and it was wearing quickly on her despite the burst of adrenaline that allowed her to come this far. "They're coming!" one of her people shouted, his voice laced with fear as the bellows of his breathing grew closer. Ugh. His heavy footsteps pounding in her ears as she kept pumping her legs as fast as she could. "Just run!" she shouted, trying hard to use as little oxygen as she could so as not to wear herself out that much quicker. They were within sight of the bridge, but as she heard the thorns gaining ground behind them, she suddenly felt a clenching sensation in her right thigh, as a painful cramp that seemed to squeeze and wring the muscle like a filthy rag dropped her to the ground. She tried as much as she could to keep going, but her body had other ideas, and as her right foot came down again, something snapped or tore, she couldn't be certain. All she knew as she hit the ground hard, all she knew in that next second was that she hit the ground hard, and the air was blasted from her lungs as she went sprawling, and that her people were likely to stop for her, and it would be the end of them. "Pick her up," said a familiar voice. The ringing of steel as her people drew their blades alerted her to the sudden trouble, but she was quick to force the pain down for just a moment, biting her teeth as she said, No, he's an ally. He kept the thorns away from us until now." "They didn't take my advice, so here they are," the stranger said in reply. "Pick her up and cross, and I'll deal with these prickly bastards." She wanted to laugh at that, but another wave of pain hit her at that moment as she groaned, collapsing once again. Thankfully, she felt her people lift her up as they started running again. He sighed internally, lifting his chin to the winds that sighed through the sparse woods that existed at this end of the island. This wasn't the reason he'd come here, and it certainly wasn't what he wanted to be doing this day. But somehow, trouble seemed to cross his path on a continual basis, and while he'd walked away more than once and allowed fate to take its course, this was one of the times he decided to stand up. Maybe it was because of his affinity for the knightly group known as the Longblades, the clan to whom the foursome obviously belonged, or maybe he just felt the need to get involved this time. Whatever the case was, Tyler felt the absolute need to stand in the path of fate, if only because it felt right. The group of thorns that had been dogging at the heels of the smaller group stopped as they saw him, perhaps thinking to take him out before moving on towards the group. As he faced them down, however, Tyler could hear the complex machinery of the bridge behind him as it was set into motion, the modifications that had been added to it over the years creating a span of whirling death that had managed to turn many an enemy since it had been constructed. One of the spike-covered creatures stepped forward, pointing at Tyler with a clawed hand as he barked something that was barely comprehensible. "End of the road, meat," he snarled. Tyler smiled, dark eyes flashing with a sheen of silver brilliance as the skies above them rumbled ominously, a blade appearing in his right hand where only moments ago a blade appearing in his right hand, which had only moments ago been empty. "Yeah," he nodded. "It is." The end. That was End of the Road. That is actually one of the stories I actually forgot writing. It's part of a greater story that I've been working on for the past 20 plus years, featuring Tyler Ferris, one of my main characters, and one that's most dear to my heart. I hope you enjoyed it. Please, if you will, subscribe to the channel, because I know my daughter and I have been working very hard on getting this going and getting as many subscribers as we can. And we'll see you next time.